Well, again, guys, thanks so much for taking the time to chat. I figure it'd be great if both of you, Eric and Matthew, could introduce yourselves.
I'm Eric Durst, and longtime visual effects supervisor on features and television. And my background is in animation. I went to Cal Arts. I have that. That's something that Matt and I both share, and use that all the time as a foundation, really understanding weight and timing and all the aspects of animation are to me really critical for filmmaking. So that's something that that's the lens I look through the shots that we look at. And that was why it was a great pleasure to work with Matt, because he has a background in that as well. So we sort of shared that. And let's see, I directed commercials for a number of years. Once I graduated from Cal Arts, I went to New York and got into the commercial world and worked at a company called DreamQuest Images for many years, one of the first VFX houses, and started their commercial division, and did that for about 10 years. So directed commercials for about 10 years, and then segued into movies. After DreamQuest, I worked at Apogee, and John Dykstra, of course, was the head of that. That's the original ILM. And my first job in a movie was actually my second job, because I worked on the original Tron, if you could believe it. But the first movie as a supervisor was Batman and Robin, which is, I got on because John Dykstra was on. So John gracefully got me into that, and I was supervising Gotham City. So it was a good way to start, and went from there and have done multiple movies, and then later got into television. The first TV episodic I did was called Genius. It's a story about Albert Einstein. That was with Ron Howard, and that was about 2017. And that's when everything just started exploding in terms of streaming, and have been doing a number of other series from there, and basically balancing episodic cinema, let's call it, and motion pictures since then.
That's awesome. That's really cool. And what about you, Matt?
As Eric said, I went to Sheridan College, which is the Canadian Cal Arts, and with a background in animation. So it was a lot of draftsmanship early on. Computers started taking over. I worked at a little shop called the Cartoon Saloon over in Ireland when I first started my career, which they've gone on to do really amazing animated features, 2D animated features, if you can believe it. And then I got into visual effects at Mr. X on Tron Legacy. Was actually my first film that I worked on. Before that, I did a little stint in commercials in 3D, kind of just learning the new computer trade that was up and coming at the time. Since then, I VFX supervised on, I think my first show was Hemlock Grove for a very, very young Netflix. Most recently finished Murder Mystery 2 for Netflix again, so it's kind of come full circle. But the experience we're talking about here was just before that, which is 5 Days at Memorial, which was the show I worked with Eric on. And yeah, my background's kind of all over the map in terms of animation, storyboarding, and previs. And then I've done kind of every job, I think, in the pipeline, from tracking all the way through to comps. So I'm very much a generalist, master of no trade.
I love that. And I'm kind of curious too, just given both your backgrounds and having strong foundations in animation, how important do you think it is for people to learn at least some understanding of animation? Because I was having this conversation recently about actually with effects people, because I felt like it's very easy these days to make a good explosion or, you know, this or that. But like, I was thinking if I were to train someone in effects these days, I would probably just train them to keyframe a lot of destruction, things like that, because I feel like if you can't do that, then having the tools that make it a lot easier, just if anything, just make it staccato and crazy rather than really understanding how to hit those beats and really understanding the importance of timing.
I think that's crucial. I mean, when I started, actually my first experience, I wasn't even going to be in animation, but I was at Cal Arts for I was in photography, and I met some animators, and I sat down, and Jules Engel, who was the leader of that whole department, came over to me and gave me a stack of paper and a pencil and said, make a film. And that's how I started. And that was ultimately one of the best gifts I ever had, because, you know, if you can make a film with with multiple sheets of paper and a pencil, and you can make it move, you'll learn everything. That is really ground one, base, the base foundation of everything. So I'm a full believer in hand-drawn animation and being able to just experience and feel it, because once you do, then you can bring all that to computer animation, and I think that's foundational.
One of the big things I find as a VFX supervisor is being able to, the bottom line is we're making 16:9 pictures for the most part. And so a lot of my time is spent drawing notes and doing things like that. And having a foundation in draftsmanship, I think, is irreplaceable. And I think keyframing animation for timing and those types of things. But I'm not sure that I'm not a dinosaur in terms of saying, like, those things as I watch AI come up and all those types of things. Fundamental drawing, is it as useful moving forward? Would I want my son to learn to draw fundamentally? Definitely for pleasure. Is it the best move for his career? I'm not sure anymore, to be honest.
I think the importance is that you feel it. It's not like you're just looking at it. You actually feel it from your core when you do that. So if for any other reason than just appreciation, or at least understanding how to communicate it, I think that's the value.
Probably one of those trickier questions to navigate, but since we brought up the topic of AI, I'm just kind of curious, both from your perspectives on AI, especially for visual effects, but also in general, like, what are your thoughts on what you've experienced so far? Because I do think it's definitely something that enables us, if anything, more than anything, to be able to knock out concept work really quickly, or be able to do broad strokes in some of our ideas and prototype them fast. But at the same time, as you said, like, there's a lot of fundamental skills that I think are so critical that these days a lot of people are going to think are a waste of time, which I still think being able to draw and being able to write cursive and all the basic things that seem to be going away are still quite valuable just to have as a skill set.
It's an open book, right? We all are watching it unfold. So there's no definite answers on this. The things that I've experienced are just mind-blowing, and they're phenomenal, and I've been very excited by them and have been able to use some of those tools. And in this point in time of development, it's been really helpful. And I think I think everyone has to up their game tremendously. I think you really have to know the tools and just ride it, because there's no way out of it. You're not going to be able to resist it. And just sometimes it will take jobs away, or take jobs away that you wanted to do necessarily, maybe you wanted to do, but also it will give you gifts. And if you can sort of just keep in the game, I think that's the only thing we can do.
Well said.
I'm old enough to remember when there was a job called an in-betweener. And I think, like, we used to, computers are a natural, I think we all have seen. I hated computer animation when I first started looking at it. I was watching, I think the first scene I saw was in Hercules. They added the Hydra in a Disney film. And I just remembered thinking, like, oh, it looks terrible. Like, why would anybody ever do that compared to the life you can add in a hand-drawn animation? But obviously, it's taken over the industry. And I feel like AI is kind of in the similar boat, where training sets aside, I think there's a huge amount of just benefit that you get from it. I've never seen the film industry turn away from moving faster and being more productive. And that's true of any capitalistic endeavor. So I think a lot of industries are going to face a big shakeup because of it. And I think legislation will kind of have to come in to help make it moral and good for society. And I fear all of those things because legislation does not move as quickly as GPU upgrades.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting subject. And you're right. It's kind of like the internet. It took many years for things to catch up. I started in doing, at least on the computer, deluxe paint animation. So it was pixel by pixel, frame by frame. And that was always kind of my philosophy too, is that, keyframes came along and everyone's like, well, we're out of a job. But it's more of a chance to pivot. But then same thing, like global illumination and radiosity and all these lighting solutions. It wasn't like the lighting artist was out of a job. It just meant that they've got new powerful tools that they can leverage. But that also being said, it's definitely grown faster than anyone can anticipate. And now I'm starting to get a little bit nervous at times. But again, as you said, it's it's something that you can't really undo. So it's more about trying to get in front of it rather than, be left behind.
Yeah.
I'd love to chat about 5 Days at Memorial. And I was curious for both of you, how did you both first get involved in the project?
Both Matt and I auditioned or interviewed for the job. And to the wisdom of the producers, they hired both of us, which was fantastic because it was a job that involved a number of skill sets. And originally Matt was going to be on-set supervisor. I was going to be supervisor and then handle the post. And once Matt started showing us the previs that he had done, and Matt is exceptional at being able to, as I say, if three of us are talking about an idea, he will be in the background and then all of a sudden say like this, and he'll show you an image that coalesces everything that we spoke about. So he's a extreme talent, good talent in
My
that.
favorite kind of meetings when that's happening.
Yeah. And so Matt was starting to visualize some of the things that we were discussing in pre-production. And then I said, Matt, I just keep doing what you're doing. I will do, I'll take the set, you do this. And so we sort of mixed our roles around and found we both have, the reason that worked so well together is that we both have different talents. And so those blended well in this case.
I was just excited to work with Eric and John Ridley and Carlton. So for me, it was one of those things where I was just really thankful to be on the show. So when I got the opportunity to pitch to help out more, I did with the previs. And we shot in Hamilton, which is just outside of my hometown in Toronto. And so that was obviously very conducive to family life for me as well. So that was nice. Eric came up and we worked together. And then Eric and Danny traveled down to NOLA to finish principal photography. And Eric stayed on. I stayed on for a little bit through post, but then jumped off onto another show just because Eric's skill set is so strong in finishing that I think I was a little redundant by that point. So
for you, Matt, like with doing previs, like what typically is your method for being able to rapidly prototype shots and come up with concepts? Is there a specific software or specific ways that you go about doing things, having lots of prefabricated models at your disposal? Or I'm just kind of curious for you, like how do you quickly knock things out and get your ideas onto screen?
Yeah, so during the meetings, for the most part up front, I'll do drawings and sketches just to try to coalesce kind of these ineffective words into that everybody's chatting about around the table into X, Y, and Z coordinates and measurements and things like that to say like this will be over here and this will be there. My original package was 3ds Max, but I moved on to Maya as kind of what I think of as my native program. And so a lot of work is just done there, although Houdini's so much better that I've picked that up to a certain extent along the way, or so much more robust, I should say. And then the place I've landed for previs is mostly Unreal Engine for just quick iterations. And there's a lot of just things that are done incredibly intelligently in UE that are things like sun position and coordinates of longitude and latitude, being able to bring in Google Maps API now as the latest thing. It's incredible to just quickly scout a location and say, this is where we're going to be and how we should shoot it for VFX at least, and then wait for the input from everybody else. So yeah, that's kind of my go through. Drawings, sketches still work, but they seem to be getting less and less useful, I have to say.
Maybe for yourself, I always find it's just a great way to get I more go through the thinking process, even if nobody ever
100%.
Yeah. With this project, when you guys first came on, were there any specific challenges or sequences that kind of stood out, like, holy crap, how are we going to pull this off?
Well, I think just the whole idea of having a city that's underwater and having a lot of footage, a lot of archival footage that showed us the context of everything with multiple people and debris everywhere. That was probably the biggest challenge, just the overall scope of everything. And then we started to break it down into all the different sequences and shots and so forth. Talking about Google Earth, we use Google Earth quite significantly in terms of location scouting. We were all in Toronto, and of course, we had to go down to New Orleans to be very specific and find certain locations, and also find certain houses and things that we use for assets. So we used the time machine feature. And one thing was very convenient about this, and I'm sure it was very purposeful, was that when you go down to locations in New Orleans, you could see a few days before the levees broke or levees breached, and then the day after. And so we were able to go to locations and very strategically look at what it was like before and what it was like after, and use that as a template for our work.
That's cool. Like, how were you typically using Google Earth? Were you able to extract a lot of stuff that you could take in other packages to kind of flesh out more, or?
Yeah, at the time the API wasn't available, so the tile set wasn't available. So we ended up doing that hack where you could grab the GPU buffer, the G buffer, and basically pulling it in. And the thing is, it was super useful just for measurements and all those types of things. And it's it's an amazing asset now that it's available to everybody.
I was talking to someone the other day about this too, that like at least the tools I had looked up a few years ago, the only thing available was like I think it's called DX Ripper for Max 2011 or something. So it was like it's a lot of desperate stuff to go back there. But yeah, being able to intervene between the graphics card and Google Earth was a surefire way to pull stuff.
Yeah, we ended up laundering everything through Blender, kind of. So it's like it was that was the methodology.
Nice. With you guys looking at specific assets like houses and buildings around New Orleans, were you doing photogrammetry builds of all of them, or how would you typically utilize a lot of the stuff that you're surveying?
Well, the architecture in New Orleans is very unique. You have these shotgun houses and various versions of that. And so we went around, we identified 27 structures, 27 houses, as well as some stores and things like that we used as our base set. And then we hired Crafty Apes, who's in Baton Rouge, to go down and do LiDAR as well as photogrammetry with drones. So we had drones circle around the houses, and were able to extract models on that. Some were dynamic because they had to blow up or had to break apart when the water hit them. But that was the foundation really for what we had to work with. Matt, you were very, very concerned about the number of assets. That was a concern, right?
Well, just in general, when you look at those destructed worlds, everything that was inside the house is now outside the house.
Yeah.
In the floating in the water, including the oil and all those things. So I think Eric and I just had early discussions about like how do we possibly make this stand up against news footage, which is what we're cutting to next. And that was our biggest concern, was the verisimilitude of the CG in general was just such a high bar, because we just couldn't afford for people to get pulled out of the story, because it's such a serious and reverent story to a certain extent about the chaos and loss of human life.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of curious too, like which vendors did you work with on this show?
We had three main vendors. So we had El Ranchito in Madrid, and we had Stormborn Studios in Vancouver. They specialize in water and fluid dynamics, and so they did the levee breach, the big shot that took 9 months to produce, and then UPP in Prague. And I've done I think 6 shows with UPP. I love those guys. So it's Victor and Vit over there, Victor Müller.
Just to kind of talk about that for a little bit, I'm kind of curious with trying to pick the right vendors and also divvy up the work. What's the typical process that you guys go through in terms of speaking to different vendors, figuring out which ones work budget-wise, but also getting studios, like having them win your confidence that they're the right vendor to do something like, let's say, a 9-month sequence. Obviously, you don't want to get halfway through and then realize that, hey, we picked the wrong team or something.
In terms of El Ranchito, I had not worked with El Ranchito before, and the producers had worked with them before and had a good relationship, so they brought them to the party, which was terrific. They're just an exceptional company, And the work that they do, like just the first images out of the box look great, and it just went from there. So they're fantastic. I had worked with UPP a lot, and so I sort of wanted them on the show and brought them. And then in terms of the fluids, I had not heard of Stormborn at that point in time. The producers also had heard of them. Our post supervisor, Rauf, had worked with them before. And so he introduced us to them, and I'm very thankful for that because they did a terrific job.
Eric and I are both savvy and have been around enough that you can get a pretty good sense of understanding from people's CVs, but also a conversation with them and ask them how they're going to approach it, because obviously resimulating a 26-second gigantic destruction sequence can't happen if you're resimulating all the time. So the big thing we dove down deeply into on discussions was just how do we art direct this, and how are we going to time it out? I did previs to start off just to try to get camera moves and ideas across to them. So I feel like they had a good foundation to start with. But then it was really about getting them to take over and be able to not take a week to get us the next iteration. And a lot of that was done with proxy geometry. And back to your comment, Alan, a lot of hand animation to say, this is the timing we're aiming for here. And it was a lot of stitching together of simulations, pieces of simulations to hit the beats that we needed to catch up with the camera, or to be ahead of the camera.
That's great. Is there any specific sequence that really stood out to you guys, on any given episode? You mentioned some giant floods and, house destruction. So I'm kind of curious, is there one in particular that you might want to lean into and talk a bit more about the overall process?
Well, I think the levee breach is the biggest shot, and the one that Matt was just describing, because it really was what was happening in the background. The way this is all set up is that the work in the hospital is very visceral. I mean, it's very intimate, and so you want to feel the people in the hospital where there's no electricity. It's 110 degrees. They're on batteries on these ventilators, and not knowing how long this is going to last. There's no rescue situation. No one has set up any plans of any relationships with helicopters or boats or anything. They're just stuck. So it's a very intense situation there. And VFX, for the most part, we describe the exterior and what was happening. And in this case, you go to the lower ninth ward and you see the levees breach and the water come. And the water, one thing that I learned about levees, and I didn't have any idea of how they breached. I thought they exploded and it was just some kind of big event that happened instantly. But what happens is that levees are made of these panels. So the panels are like 8 to 10 feet long, and then they're stacked up next to each other. And so what happens is that the water is on this side and it starts to go over the backside, and it goes to the foundation and it compromises the foundation and then flops over. So all these panels are holding water back immediately release, and the water comes forward. And so you have this water that comes, this tidal wave that is like 12 to 20 feet high, and it just wipes everything out. So it was a very dynamic event. And this was like the monster that everyone in the hospital didn't know about that's coming. And that set up the tension for what was happening throughout the series, or in the early episodes when they were just understanding that the threat was much bigger than they had anticipated.
That's great.
Yeah, and we had another shot with El Ranchito in episode 1 that opens the series that I think is 1.5 minutes or something. And it's just a really austere shot, staying with the characters as they discover the bodies that were euthanized in the hospital. And it's traveling through it's kind of setting up the world of post-flood in NOLA. And it was really, it was one of the first shots we prevised, we talked about as a group. And it was one of the last shots that we shot on the set. So it was just one of those fun things where you got to see it. I think we looked at that shot for months and months. I looked at that shot for months and months and months. I know Eric looked at the other shot for longer, but yeah, it was just a long relationship with it, and it's amazing. El Ranchito did that shot, and the background is just seamless. Where we were in 150 by 280 foot, 130 by 280 foot tank in Hamilton, in Canada. And I don't think anybody suspects that we weren't in NOLA for that shot. And that's the fun for me, is just helping. I think seeing all that come to fruition was pretty amazing.
I'm sure I'm not alone though in this, but I always collect it's kind of like yellow stickets of like the director's little stick man with a big explosion or something, and I always find it humorous to then look at the final result and it's like, it's actually pretty accurate to that crappy little drawing on a sticket that someone put on your desk. So I'm always fascinated by that, just kind of seeing the whole journey, whether it's blood and sweat and tears or, sometimes like you get a random shot that comes together in just a couple of days. I was curious just to talk a little bit about any specific sequence you want, but just doing more of a macro level view of start to finish, like just for anyone who's not familiar with the typical process of show coming in, getting greenlit, and then from there, you guys coming on board, doing script treatment, breaking everything down, and then fishing for vendors, taking on the sequences and letting them roll with it all the way through to final delivery. So I was just kind of curious, like for you, either one of you, if you want to talk a little bit about what the macro level process is for a show starting at just like a very specific shot or sequence, like seeing the kind of life to death of an entire shot.
Well, I think I started in January of that year, about maybe 4 months before we got to Toronto, and was breaking down the script, putting numbers to it, just sort of getting a feel for where we were, seeing if we could work within the budget. It's always fascinating to me because when you start, it's a vague dream. It's like almost like a cloud, like these ideas that swim in and out, and then in the end, it's concrete and it's like, well, it's obvious what we were going to do, but in the beginning, it's not. And so, just starting that process from the beginning and figuring out the different skill sets that were needed, and looking at facilities, putting a list of facilities that could be possibly the right match for this, and then coming up to Toronto. And at that point, we were still in COVID protocols, so we were like, Matt and I and Danny, we had not met. We had just seen each other remotely, and actually that happened throughout the whole process. In the end, editing was, I've never met the editors, so they were all remote, even though they're here in LA. But right. That was something that sort of kept everything at a distance. But I think the process of trying to be more and more specific as things evolve, because things do evolve. And once I got into Toronto and Matt was on and everyone was on, then we got a chance to work with the directors, and having Matt's skill sets of being able to help visualize things that help concretize ideas that were very vague. We were trying to figure out locations as well. For instance, we have a lot of sequences that are on a helipad, and we were going to shoot, and this is where reality and economics sort of come together. Everyone's trying to do things the best way, but they're really trying to do them the least expensive way at the same time. So we spent a lot of time, like many, many days, looking at rooftops around Toronto, figuring that we could find some magic parking lot on some building that we could land helicopters, and the background would look just like New Orleans, and we could get it all in camera. Of course, that was a fantasy, but chasing those kinds of streams of ideas takes a lot of time, and we did a lot of those.
Yeah, a few notes on that. Like we had part of the problem is with a background that's a storm. The question is, what's the background really worth to you? Because the trees have to be denuded post-storm. You have to have water everywhere. And probably, as Eric was saying early on, the architecture in New Orleans is not like Toronto. It's not like many places. It's these thin, skinny shotgun houses because they tax by the property front.
Yeah.
So everybody built skinny, long houses, much like they do in Holland. So yeah, I think we started seriously just asking those questions about what are these things worth, and you try to put a value on each of the things that you can get. So one of the issues we had was we ended up in a field to build the helicopter pad. And the next question was like, okay, well, if we're in a field with blue screens, how are we going to track everything as a helicopter lands? Like we had a Black Hawk and a Coast Guard helicopter come into and land on our pad. So we kind of came up with, we talked to the Matthew Davies, our production designer, and came up with like just GoPro arrays around the set that could allow us to triangulate if anything went wrong, if we had too much movement and a track failed. We did also that at the tank, because the other issue was we're just in a huge pool for most of the time. So where's the camera? What do you track to? And then we actually placed tennis balls on poles. John Tennant, our lead grip, built us these little poles with tennis balls on top with concrete on the bottom in buckets that we could just pull into this thing and drop in the water. And they were just tall enough to be above the water line. So we just have concrete little tracking marks, little green tennis ball tracking marks around the water that were easy to paint out and allowed us to actually get a track when we're on a longer lens. So those types of, I think, you know, we are in an incredibly insular industry where the knowledge set is so specific that a lot of the times you just have to ask for these crazy builds from people and hope that you have a good team. And our team around us, John McGillivray, who built the tank, John Tennant, who was our lead grip, who was grabbing things in and out of the pool all the time, our water safety guys, stunts, Scion stunts, and our production designer, Matthew Davies, were just also willing to help us achieve the vision. That I think that's what made it all work.
Figuring out how the blue screens work, because when you have helicopters coming in, you don't want to surround everything where they block off access. So you want to have access in the blue screens, and doing a giant build for both the helipad and also the water tank was a big deal. So we had telehandlers with what was it, 20 by 40 blue screens on them.
20 by 30, yep.
20 by 30, and then we can move them around, and we could stack them on top of each other and just look at the camera angle and then drive them in very quickly. And it was a brilliant solution being able to do that, because sometimes you had helicopters flying in somewhat low, and then you could remove the blue screens very quickly and then put them in the background. And that was quite a brilliant solution.
And we had, for the first 5 episodes, we had something like 22 minutes previs with the camera moves. And I can't give enough credit to the directors for sticking to the previs. It helped us out so much that they weren't changing their minds. They knew what they wanted. And when we talked about it in the first meetings, like we iterated a little bit, but they were just like, no, the camera needs to do this. And it was much more austere filmmaking than I've ever been part of before. So the camera moves were intentional and the shots were long, but they didn't change. So it was really a huge help.
This wasn't traditional previs where they give a vision and we go away and then we come back with a result. This was interactive. And so we had multi-hour long sessions several times a week. And it's like we were all in the room and we're trying to simulate the idea that we were virtually on the set. And they I think felt very much that they participated, and that's one of the reasons that it didn't change, because it was like their idea, they had evolved as we evolved with the ideas as well.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I'm always amazed by that too with previs, like when it's kind of like the yellow stick-it, like when it actually stays accurate all the way through and you're like shot to shot, like you can actually see that. Because I've definitely worked on shows even recently where the VFX Sups texting me on set like, yeah, we're making a whole other movie than what you guys put on and storyboarded, and you know, so we're gonna reboot everything when we come back, because there's the hero cam, but then the BCD seems like those cameras seem to be shooting the other film that the director's starting to ponder in their head.
For sure, yeah.
In terms of just knowing how serious and important this show is, as well as it needing to be believable, what do you look for when it comes to photorealism? I always feel like everyone has different things that their eye kind of really fixates on to kind of challenge themselves, like, is this believable? I'm kind of curious for both of you when reviewing shots and trying to get the integration to that level that you can sign off on. What are the things that you really look for? Are there little cheats, hacks, things that you tend to do just to help trick your eye into like whether or not you can believe it as being real or not?
There's so much texture, so much debris, so much detritus everywhere. You couldn't really cheat. And this is one where we were, if there were any notes, it was usually to add more. And so sometimes you can get away with things. The camera's going to move over here, and maybe this background isn't built as well as you had hoped, but because it's moving, you don't even think about it. In this case, the shots didn't move around that much. They were very much not locked, but slow moves. And so you saw everything. So Matt, what do you think? I mean, and there wasn't much cheating here.
No, I'm with you. I think the biggest thing we said early on was that, and my kind of mantra is nothing says real like real. I love visual effects, but for us, when they asked us how big the tank needed to be, we said, what can you build that doesn't structurally break? Like, it was like, build it as large as you can, and we'll take over from there, moving outwards, I guess, from the ER ramp specifically is what we shot mostly there. But interaction with water, all those types of things, you just don't want to be doing it in CG if there's another way to do it. And that was true of building the houses. That's why we did photogrammetry and LiDAR, is that, you know, on half the house, there's ivy growing and some weird mold and an old piece of wood that the guy left out front. And not that we don't have incredibly talented artists who can replicate that, but sometimes the life of a project or a place exists in capturing it, and it's building it from scratch is too laborious, and we don't have enough time and we don't have enough budget. So I'm a big proponent of data acquisition, and anytime we could do something physically, even if we ended up replacing it, like that car shot, Eric, where the car is coming to we asked them to put a car in the water and drag it. And we ended up replacing the car because the angle was better in the end. If it looked a little bit more tilted, then they could make it on the day. But you had that one-to-one correlate, and you can sample in Nuke your RGB values and just ask, where does this need to go based on maths? And I find I often intuitively get things wrong. You know, in draftsmanship, we used to stand in front of mirrors and you do your life drawing and then turn around and be like, oh, my bias is slightly left. And you're always just trying to fight your meat brain to get what really is happening versus what you think is happening.
That's really cool. What are your go-to tools that you bring on set? Whether it is specific things like the good old tape measure that we all bring along, but also more importantly, apps, things like that, since it seems like these days there's a lot more apps on a phone that people are relying on than other tools. So what are your go-to tools and apps that you typically bring with you everywhere you go?
Artemis, obviously, just to lens things up. In Unreal, the big thing is getting your film back correct. So when you go there on the day, you end up with the exact lens at the exact distance that you wanted it. The capture app, there's a 3D scanner app on the iPad Pros that I use a ton, because you don't have to measure on the day. You can just capture all the data and measure later.
No, I mean, having the LiDAR sort of built in for measurements has been helpful.
Yeah.
The iPhone, there's a big jump between iPhone 13 and 14 in terms of the photography. I mean, I used to bring a big Canon and do all that, and now I do a lot of it with the iPhone, just because it's you end up going to these locations and having to bring all that stuff is difficult. So I use that not for final imagery, but just to get a sense, not for textures, but just to get a sense of where we were. And I try to photograph as much of the world as possible. It's amazing how you think on the set you're photographing everything, and then you get back a month later and realize you have nothing, and or have so much less than you thought you had. And so my sort of idea is always, when you're on the set, is imagine it burned up and it went away. Like, how would you recreate the set? Always being able to recreate wherever you are, even though it seems like, oh, we have one shot at a grocery store. But even that sometimes comes back mysteriously for some extra photography. Yeah.
And then just talking about actual gear, I think Eric picked up the Theta Z1 for bracketed exposure 360 HDRs at the time. We built those GoPro rigs where we picked up 8 GoPros for surrounding the set. We used the little blue guys for ultra syncs, they're called, to sync.
Oh, right.
And we happened to be shooting at 2398, which worked with the GoPros because their true 24 is not true 24.
Right.
But we ended up having to put time code in through audio, which was a little bit of a pain because you have to pull that out later.
Yeah.
And then early tests, like I've been a Red 1 owner since the camera came out, and I think I stopped upgrading at Epic Dragon because
I stopped after the Epic Helium. I was just like,
oh yeah,
I'm going
the price jump was significant all of a sudden. It was
$2,000 for like a half a terabyte of storage. It's just like, it's insane.
Yeah, but we did early tests. Eric and I went out when they were constructing the helicopter pad, and we just moved with the camera, and we said, it led us to early discussions about the fact that, a lot of people don't know that horizon lines are always in line with the camera. And you have to educate a lot of producers on that. It's like you don't see, when you're higher, the horizon line doesn't go down, you see farther. And those kind of concepts, again, our meat brains are not intuitive to those types of things. And you just need to disabuse people of those kind of silly concepts early on so that you don't end up fighting that battle 100 times as you deliver shots.
That's an interesting point, because that's something that really came up. I mean, people want to feel like you're really high, and they feel like, horizon line is going to go way down because you're so high, and it will make it feel like it's high. And then when you do it in a crude form, it may not look right, but then once you get the detail in there, it does look right. So there are all these gaps in feeling what it should be, and also knowing what it should be, and then having everybody wait for a minute, take a beat, and then you see it in a more proper form, and then they finally get on board and understand it. So
I love it. This has been really great just to discuss everything to do with this project, because again, like, it looks amazing, and at the same time, like, I can't imagine how challenging it is to pull something like this off, and while also wrestling with the fact that this isn't a Marvel film where you're expecting lens flares and camera shakes and everything else. It's all going to be invisible, which is the biggest challenge of all. And what's next for both of you?
I'm actually involved in a show right now that I'm doing consulting on. I have shooting 2 movies at the same time. It's a 3-year project. So we're talking about how that will evolve.
Yeah, and I'm on a show called Apples Never Fall for NBC Universal right now. That's over in Australia, but we've shut down, of course, because of the strike. And we're just looking at the post for the first couple episodes and kind of continuing on as best we can while we wait to see how this resolves itself, or how the people resolve.
Yeah.
Just curious too, where in Australia are you shooting?
We're in the Gold Coast. Oh yeah, right. You're Australian originally. I forgot.
Yeah, I hide my accent.
Good. Yeah.
A lot of the time.
I spent over 3 years there, so I know it well.
Cool. Whereabouts?
In Sydney.
Cool.
Basically,
nice. Yeah. I grew up on like the Sunshine Coast, but I'd spent a lot of time on the Gold Coast, especially on the Warner Brothers set, and then Fox Studios was my second home down in Sydney.
Oh yeah.
It's such a funny place now because the theme parks have encroached. So you're shooting and then you walk outside and people are going, down in a roller coaster.
That was the advantage of the Gold Coast, is like you on your lunch break, you just walk across to the theme park and you're at Movie World. And
that's right. Yeah. But it was a great place. They were lovely people, and the nature and everything. My son got to come down. So it's just an amazing, spectacular country.
It really is.
Well, again, congratulations on all your success. I believe it's up for an Emmy. Is that correct?
Yep. Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, again, this has been really amazing. I appreciate both you guys taking the time to chat. And again, this has been so great to catch up.
Thanks so much,
Alan.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, enjoyed it.